Right, good morning folks. My name is Shane Webb and I think most of you will know me because you've all attended one or two of our or more of our webinars before, and yeah, it's very exciting to be involved in this. It's not something that I just wanted to do for the hang of doing it. We've had a number of attendees actually request an ethics webinar, and the thing that really did it for us was obviously Andrew from the IAC is one of the directors requesting it as well for his people. And so here we have it, and this is the first session, hopefully the first of many. We're going to look for your feedback during and at the end, and yeah, I hope that it's going to go really well. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to cross over to Tim, who's sitting next to me, Tim Brown, and I'm just going to ask him to introduce himself and also just mention briefly how ethics applies in the work that he does. Thanks, Tim. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Wayne. Good morning, folks. My name is Tim Brown, and I'm an attorney with Venns Attorneys. I'm not a criminal law attorney, so I'm not faced with the classic stark scenarios. Should you defend a person who you know is guilty of a heinous offense, and if so, how should you conduct that defense? I don't get involved in those kind of classic and stark ethical dilemmas. My situation is more subtle. I do commercial work, commercial and corporate work. So they deal more with issues like how do you deal with a conflict of interest? What does it mean to keep your client's information confidential? What does it mean to be trustworthy? What's expected of an attorney in these kind of situations? What does it mean to fairly draft a contract appropriately recording the oral agreements that a client has already entered into? What are fair negotiating practices? It's those kind of issues that come up for me every day, and that's why I'm excited to be here. I especially enjoy sharing and getting input from other professions and disciplines. So I'm looking forward to the input, especially from the accountants out there. One of our classic vintage legal ethics textbooks says that an attorney should be described or defined by a high level of candor or honesty. And I suppose it's a bit like going to a McDonald's. You know what kind of hamburger you're going to get at a McDonald's, in theory at least, and ideally, when you go to an attorney, you should expect a high level of trustworthiness. Primarily, an attorney is appointed to act in their client's best interests. So they must not act with fear or favor. They mustn't be intimidated. They must act not in their own interests and in fact against their own interests if necessary, and act in the best interests of their clients.
On that note, let me hand over to Andy.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Andy Pike. The way I fit in here is that I was an engineer, lectured engineering at university for about a decade, which involved its own ethical questions and dilemmas. And then I joined the full-time ministry. So I trained to be a minister at seminary, and there we had to study ethics. And I've now been full-time minister for about 10 years, and obviously had to deal with ethical situations on an ongoing basis. And what I'll be doing is presenting 3 sessions over the next 3 weeks on the basic principles of ethics, how are we to understand ethics, how are we to try and work out the best ethical solution to a particular situation. So I'm not in the business world. I've got my colleagues here with me to deal with those sort of questions, but hopefully I can give you a basic introduction to the principles of ethics.
Right, well, thanks very much, guys. I'm going to just put up the panel, all 4 of us. I've got a slide prepared which shows all 4 of us, and so there we see it. There's Andy, there's Tim, Wayne, and myself. I think what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to cross over to Andy just to take us through some of the theory. There's going to be theory in all 3 of these sessions, and just to talk a little bit more about that in case some of you missed it. This webinar series is actually run as a series. They're not 3 separate sessions that are repeated. There are 3 consecutive sessions, if you like, and they will always be held at 9 o'clock on a Friday. So they're going to run from 9 until 10:30, and yeah, we look forward to working with you guys. There's going to be a bit of theory, as I say, and so Andy's going to do that now. He's going to take you through a whole lot of slides, and then we're going to stop. We're going to handle a couple of questions and polls and things like that. So there we go, guys. I hope that you find this beneficial. I'm just going to pause the recording for a second here.
And what I'm wanting to do, I'm hoping you can see our screen, is give you a brief look at the course outline as we're going to be doing it. There are 5 sessions that I want us, well, 5 sections that I want us to cover in our course. What is ethics? Why are ethics important? What is the basis of ethics? Looking at different ethical systems, and then how do we do ethics? There's the practical thing. There's where the rubber hits the road, as it were. In this session today, we're going to be looking at the first 2. So what is ethics, and why is ethics important? Ethics has been defined as the study of morals. The problem there is that that definition confuses ethics and morals, and we don't want to do that. We want to keep them separate. They are different words, as we know, and they have different meanings. So we need to define what ethics are as opposed to morals. Morality, or being moral, refers to the ethical norms that a society expects its people to adhere to. The word morals comes from the Latin word which means pertaining to manners, literally, pertaining to manners. Ethics, on the other hand, talks about customs, habits, culture in a way. It refers to the way of life, a way in which morality is practiced, especially in a communal context when people are living side by side or working side by side. So ethics deals with moral values and obligations, discerning what is right and wrong, doing what is right or good, fulfilling obligations that you've committed yourself to, doing your duty, as it were. So it's really important to know the difference between ethics and morals. The ancient Greeks said that ethics is about doing the good life. It sounds very noble. It's actually quite a selfish definition, because they figured that if you focused on the virtues necessary to have the good life, you would have the best life possible. It would bring you the most happiness and fulfillment possible if you could live the good life. You wouldn't even be debating the wrong choices, because your ethical system safeguards you against that. Of course, there are often more than one right option, and ethics is how you choose between which is the better of 2 good options. You might say that an ethical man knows he shouldn't cheat on his wife, but the moral man won't cheat on his wife. Because the ethical system is your structure for life. It gives you the hooks that you need to live the moral life. And so it's no good just being ethical. You also need to be moral. It's no good just knowing what is right but not doing it. Ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do. I hope that you're seeing the difference between ethics and morals, because that's a really important distinction to note. Ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do. So the law might say you have a right to do something, but what is the right thing to do? Well, that's where your moral system and values come into play. So true ethics will answer these sort of questions. What makes a just or a good society? That's a very broad definition. We're looking at society as a whole. You might put a country there. Secondly, zooming into the person. What makes a virtuous or a good person? True ethics will define that for you. So that's on a personal level. And then going down even more, getting more specific, what makes a particular decision responsible or good? So the good person living in a good society, making good decisions, well, the ethical system will define that for you. Have a look at this cartoon. I think it illustrates quite nicely what we've been saying this morning. So Rat says, why take the hard road? Why should I change my my ethical system? It's easy just to lower the system. Why change my behavior? It's just easier to change my standards and then to make my standards match my behavior. And then I'll be living consistently with my ethical standards. And of course, we don't want to be doing that. We're wanting our moral standards, our conduct, to live up to our ethical standards or the ethical policy of a company or a business. Rat, of course, here confuses ethical conduct in the first picture with morals, his behavior. My ethical conduct, actually what he means is my morals have begun to sink below my standards, my ethical system. I think it's time for me to change. Not his morals, he means, but he's going to bring his standard down to meet his morals, which is, of course, the wrong way to go. So what is the goal of all this? What you're wanting in your business, what you're wanting in your family, what you're wanting in your personal life is both to be an ethical leader and a moral person. Someone whose morals conduct, their day-to-day conduct, their day-to-day decisions, to live up to a particular ethical standard that might be set by the country, might be set by your culture, might be set by your own personal choices in life. Well, we move on now to why is ethics important? Why do we bother worrying about ethics in society? Is there any point in this? Well, I think that picture pretty much summarizes our society at the moment. We hear political leaders lamenting the loss of a moral compass, asking especially religious leaders, in my context as a minister of a church, that we need to be helping with the moral regeneration of society. We really are a society, I think, that it's quite obvious has lost its moral compass. A French philosopher, Albert Camus, has said, a man without ethics is a wild beast loosed upon this world. The difference between human beings and wild beasts is that wild beasts simply live by instinct. We don't live only by instinct, we do up to a point, but we can make choices, and those choices will depend on our ethical system. And so ethics are important to have as a person, as a company, because without ethics, you really can sink down to being nothing or no different to a wild beast, as someone who just responds to situations by instinct with no thought therein. I wanted to finish each session out of our 3 sessions going through 10 universal ethical principles. I'm going to do 3 every session, 4 for the last one to make up the 10, but I thought this might just be a practical way of us rounding off the theory. So the first 3 universal ethical principles would be these. I get this from a book, can't remember the author right now, I'll put it up later. So I've stolen these unashamedly. These are not my own ideas. Firstly is respect all people. In a family, in a business, respect all people. People are individuals worthy of respect. There are people with feelings, there are people with home situations, there are people with particular gifts and talents, and we would be foolish not to respect that, not to recognize that. And the business will suffer if we don't respect people, both in terms of them as people, but also them in terms of what they can offer. Often people are capable of far more than we give them credit for. Secondly, don't lie. Don't lie. To tell a lie once, just tell a lie once, and all your truths become questionable after that. I think VW have learnt that, and Wayne is going to speak a little bit more to that later. But tell a lie once, and it takes you years and years and years to rebuild the trust and to win the clients back and to have them respect you like they once did. And then the last one for today is to avoid bribes. Avoid bribes. This is the anti-bribery policy of Coca-Cola that I pulled off their website. It's an 11-page document, so they take this quite seriously. I wanted to point out a few things from this. This is what Coca-Cola say in their company. Prohibited payments include but are not limited to the following: to induce the recipient to award a contract to the company, obtain advantageous tax or customs treatment that would not otherwise be available to Coca-Cola, or to circumvent or cause non-enforcement of laws or regulations applicable to the company. They go on to talk about that bribery includes more than just money. It includes anything, giving anything of value, not just money. Involves providing business opportunities, favorable contracts, stock options, gifts, and entertainment. And so Coca-Cola are saying, we don't want that to be part of the way we do business. The benefit, even if the benefit is for someone other than the party making the payment, the business sought is not with the government. The payment does not, in fact, influence the government official's conduct. The foreign government official initially suggested the payment. In all such cases, payments are barred as far as Coca-Cola go. And then lastly, the UKBA, the United Kingdom bribery policy, also specifically prohibits the offering or acceptance of corrupt payments and other advantages between private, that is non-government persons and entities. Such conduct constitutes commercial bribery, often known as kickbacks. So big is this problem that the United Nations Global Compact has been formed. More than 8,500 companies representing 163 countries have joined this compact, have signed an agreement that they would, there are 10 principles that they've agreed to. The 10th one is businesses should work against corruption in all its forms, including extortion and bribery. And most of the big international corporates have signed this compact. Well, we'll go on next week with looking at the other of our 5 main sections. We've looked at what is ethics, why is ethics important. Next week we'll pick up the basis of ethics, ethical systems, and more practically, how do we then do ethics. That's all I have for today. I hope it's been helpful, and I'm going to pass back to Shane.
We had, in response to the first question, we had 69% going for no. So Wayne, thanks very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Shane. Shane, I wonder, would you be able to put the questions back up again, just so we can see them as well? Thank you. All right. So the question then that I'd like to tackle first, or certainly give my 5 cents worth here, is one client tells me something in confidence. That information would save another client hardship if they knew. Should I tell them? Now, to start off with, you guys have said, majority of you have said no, you wouldn't share it. I would tend to take a slightly different view on that, and you can kind of look at it from my 5 principles, my fundamental principles around accounting ethics. And the first one there would be the integrity one, and that is to say, well, can I be honest and straightforward with my second client, if you like, and give them information that would help them. You know, my passion is always to help my clients. That's kind of what we're there for as accountants. Is we want to try and help our clients and help them be better at what they do in business. But you want to do that without sacrificing your own integrity. So you know, the one is the one of your pillars is confidentiality there. So you kind of want to find a way of sharing the information with your second client, or guiding your second client into making the right decision for himself without breaching the confidentiality of your first client. One of the things that you could do there as well is possibly approach the first client and ask for permission to share the information with a second client. So that way you would not be breaching your confidentiality or your integrity, but still helping your second client. Perhaps one of the other ways that I would look at it is rather than give them information which is confidential, ask them questions. In other words, guide them into making the right decision themselves by saying to them, have you thought about this aspect? Have you considered this particular risk in this particular business in a way that doesn't breach the confidentiality of your first client? So I would tend to rather steer towards trying to assist and avoid the hardship that my second client would incur, but at the same time avoiding breach of confidentiality or integrity. I think Tim would like to comment on this.
Yeah. Those are very interesting points, Wayne. I would want to add two qualifiers, and I suppose it's indicative of how complex ethical issues can be in our world. But for me, the two qualifiers would be, firstly, is the information already in the public domain? If it is, then the duty of confidentiality doesn't arise in my view. The second would be the nature of the hardship. If it's going to close down a business opportunity for that client, that's one level of hardship. If they're going to suffer some kind of physical harm, obviously if someone's about to drive off a cliff, you would tell them that. So also in Andy's scenario, when someone approaches him in confidence and advises that they're about to commit a serious crime, where does his level of confidentiality start or stop? So I think it's about the nature of the hardship and the nature of the information. I like Wayne's point about managing how you disclose that information. You can possibly strip it of identifying features that also might be a way of conveying the information in a way that's not objectionable. And of course, as Wayne mentioned, the ultimate would be to get the first client's consent to some kind of disclosure. We're then all in the clear.
Yeah, Tim, just to butt in there, if I may, one of our participants, Dorothea, as you can see on the screen, thank you, has suggested that very point. Tim, there's another way of doing this. Ask the client if you can use the information to save somebody else. Yeah. So I think they're agreeing with you there, Tim.
Yeah, that's the sort of gold standard. If you have consent, informed consent, you can go ahead and do it. And possibly a step down from that is managing the way in which you disclose that information. Can you do it in a way that has integrity, doesn't place your first client in any kind of difficulty or expose them in any unfair manner?
Tim, if I may play devil's advocate here for a moment and say let's say you spoke about levels of hardship there. What about if we took this to the extreme and say that actually we're talking about a life-threatening thing here? How does that change the dynamic?
I mean, my view is that then you've got an obligation to convey that information. So, for example, there's a doctor-client privilege, but if a doctor becomes aware that someone is being abused, that's overridden and they've got to report it. So there's certain overriding factors that I think that's what makes ethics so complex. It's never purely black and white. There's the classic scenario, can you lie? You would generally say no. But go back to the Second World War and the Nazis are knocking on your door and asking if there are any Jewish people in your basement. Yes, you should lie. So it's never straightforward in black and white, and there are always factors that have to be taken into account.
Andy?
Just from a different perspective, very different to the business world, I suppose. But I never tell someone that I will promise never to convey the information. My principles that I use is that if they might hurt themselves or hurt others or do something illegal, I might need to disclose that. I don't think there's any sort of clergy or minister-client privilege that I'm protected by, as might be the case in other professions. But this is especially important in my world when it comes to children who might confide in you something that's going on, some sort of abuse that's happened. I am bound by law to report that to child welfare. And I really should, even if the law wasn't there. for the protection of a minor and the protection of an innocent and vulnerable person.
All right. One of the other aspects to this, and I think it kind of ties to what you're saying, Andy, and Tim as well, is that as accountants, we also have certain circumstances that we're obliged to report. Those are actually set out in the various codes as well, where there is a certain breach that your client has made, or an action that's happened or hasn't happened, and that we're obliged to actually report to the regulatory authorities, whoever they might be, whether it's a Companies Act breach or whether it's an audit issue, and we have to report it to the international regulatory body there. So those are kind of exceptions to that kind of confidential side of the fundamental principles to confidentiality. But generally, you would obviously try and protect your client wherever you can. Tim, is there any aspect here? I mean, Andy has mentioned that we don't have client privilege, client attorney privilege as you do. How does that help you compared to us? Because as accountants, we don't have that either.
Yeah, client attorney privilege really comes up in the court situation. So you can use that privilege to decline to hand over certain information. So, for example, if you've given your client a letter of advice setting out the strengths and weaknesses of their position, you can't be forced to disclose that, so it can be used against your client, for example. Yeah. But I mean, you mentioned instances where we cannot guarantee confidentiality, Wayne, and I think, as you say, it's a very good point there. There are multiple instances. So under money laundering legislation, for example, probably applies to you too, but certainly us as attorneys, if we are involved in a transaction or are given a deposit in what might be regarded as suspicious circumstances, we're obliged to report that. We're also obliged not to tell the client that we're doing that. So, I mean, that's a serious, in a way, a breach of confidentiality, but it's acceptable within our ethical system and it's legislated.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Tim. Shane, have you got anything to add there from your end?
Yeah, just one or two questions that came through as well that I haven't actually put up. The one was from Val, just regarding what about reportable irregularities to SARS and so on, and that's a very good point. And then also Devesh just said that you would disclose without giving details without going into detail. He just disclosed the gist of it. I don't know, did I actually share the results of that second poll? I don't know if I did. Let me just actually share that at this point. It was very different to the first one. Here we had 57% going for yes and 43% going for no. And I wonder if it would change if we were to run that poll again after we've had a bit of a chance to think it through and to discuss it. Guys, we're going to handle the questions for this series like this. And maybe you could just let me have your comments on that. Do you think it's a good thing to do, that we just get your immediate feedback and then we'll discuss it, and then we'll, I think not necessarily every time, but more often than not, we'll probably run the poll again just to see if there's a change in opinion after kind of thinking it through and hearing from the panel. I think that we can maybe leave that at the, and unless there's something else. The second question. Okay, sorry, we're looking at the second question now. So there's the results, 57% yes, and can I just ask who's going to basically comment on that second question? Who's going to kick off? All right, Wayne seems to have lots to say, so we're going to hand back to Wayne.
Right, folks, the second question there is it right to guarantee confidentiality to someone or anyone? I guess we have, I guess, mostly covered that in the sense that we've recognized that there are circumstances where we can't possibly guarantee it. Andy, you mentioned earlier that you never do guarantee that. So that's possibly something that we just need to watch out for in a professional context, is not to represent to anybody, and this I guess goes back to our integrity, and that's to be honest and straightforward with people, is to say, look, there might be times where I can't guarantee what you're telling me I'm going to keep confidential. are certainly within the bounds of my professional ethics. I'll keep it confidential, but there are going to be times where I'm obliged to disclose that information. Right, Shane?
Thanks, guys. There's a question that came through specifically from Xolani, which I might actually put up now before we do the VW case study, if that's in order with you guys. Is that okay? Tim, maybe you could just have a look at this. I'm going to put it up on the big screen for everybody to see. So that's a bit unfair. Unfortunately, we need to get this a bit better rigged so that you can have a sort of first sight of it. But maybe I should just read it to give you the chance to mull it over as well. Xolani writes, "Hi Tim, when you say an attorney should act in the best interests of their client," so this was following that introduction earlier, does it mean if falsifying the financial statements for the purpose of misleading a court of law to rule in favor of your client would be acceptable, as it is in the best interest of your client to win? I'm going to hand over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Xolani, that's a very interesting and good question. I think it goes back to Andy's point that in ethics, we're often dealing with the best approach between two rights. So, for example, in this case, the attorney's got two duties. The one is to act in the best interest of his client, but the second one is he or she is also an officer of the court, and they've got a duty to the court. So the poor old attorney is pulled in two directions. He, in terms of his or her duty to the court, they're not allowed to mislead the court. If they're found by a judge or a magistrate to have knowingly presented misleading or incorrect evidence, they can be reported to the Law Society and ultimately struck off the roll. It's a very serious offence. So I think attorneys are placed in a very interesting and fairly unique position with a set of obligations to a range of different people or entities. In this case, both the client and the court. But a very interesting question, Xolani. Thank you.
All right, for my 5 cents worth there, if we had to change that, Xolani, and look at it from the accountant's perspective, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, we run an IFRS for SMEs course where we look at the financial statement presentation, and there is actually provision made within the International Financial Reporting Standards when we're dealing with particularly contingent liabilities or liabilities. And we say that there might actually be a situation where the disclosure that you make on the financial statements might prejudice the client in some kind of court proceedings, where you're saying that because accountants, we're conservative and we want to kind of look at the worst case scenario, and if we go and disclose that on the financial statements, the litigant might actually use that against the client by saying, look, you're kind of making an admission on your financial statements that you owe us that money. And IFRS actually specifically deals with that by saying that in those kinds of circumstances, it's actually okay not to make that disclosure on the financial statements. Okay, we've got another question there from Lorette. If you have a client who's committing fraud, do you keep this confidential? Okay, well, now, Lorette, thank you for the question. I think what we've... Yeah, actually, Shane, that's a great idea. Let's run a poll on that, and then we can see. What do you guys think?
Let me just hit the record button. We have got 86% saying no, so that's very strong, strongly in favour of no.
Chris has just come up with a very wise comment, which is dump the client immediately. That sounds like good advice to me. But I just wanted to ask you, Wayne, if I'm right, as a tax practitioner, you've got certain positive reporting obligations to SARS in the event of tax fraud. Is that correct?
In certain circumstances, yes. But I think you got me on the spot here because I'm not actually sure what the answer to that is. But I think what it comes also down to the advice is to say, well, you know, if you are a party to that, so in other words, if you're preparing the tax return for the client, then absolutely you would be a party to that fraud, and absolutely it's a no-no, and you just can't do it. Never mind report it, you can't do it. And then I would go along with Chris and say, you know, you kind of got to look at it and say, is this the kind of client that you want to have, as opposed to dropping the client and getting a better one. Leonard's comment there: if one keeps quiet about fraud and it comes to court, you as the accountant can be aiding and abetting the fraud. Yeah, well, you'll certainly be implicated in it, and again that comes back to that professional behaviour and bringing your profession into disrepute. Because from an auditing perspective, it's that the principle of the independence. You not only want to be independent, but you want to be seen to be independent. And you could apply that same principle here, as to say that you might not be actually aiding and abetting the fraud, but if the perception is that you are a part of that, then you are bringing your profession into disrepute. So from that perspective, you've got to weigh that up against the confidential nature of what your client has told you. Andy, have you got anything to say?
Just a couple of things. I think if we're talking about fraud, we're not just talking about the lesser of two choices, the less good of two good choices. We're talking about something illegal. It's clearly illegal. And if that's what we're talking about, then we're not just talking about something that's unethical. We're talking about something that's immoral as well. And so I think that in my situation, by turning a blind eye, doing absolutely nothing about it, it would mean that my moral standards have sunk to that of the person that's my client in this case. Not only that, but scripturally, as a minister of the gospel, I'm commanded to live under the laws of the government, and therefore should report it if I'm aware of it. But on the other hand, Scripture also teaches that God is gracious. God is the God of second chances. God is a God who seeks repentance and gives ample opportunity for repentance. He's not just a God of justice, but he's a God of grace. And so I would really urge the client, urge the person who I'm dealing with to repent, to set matters right. Not that I want to blackmail them. If you don't, I'll turn you in, and not in a holier than thou attitude. Sin is sin, no matter how big or small it is. But I would be seeking a positive response from the person. But if needs be, and there's an unwillingness to set the matter right, I think I would be obligated to report it in my particular context.
Tim, if I may kind of add my own slant here, and again play devil's advocate here, I have had the situation where we've picked up fraud within a particular client. It's not the client themselves, but perhaps a staff member of the client. And one of the issues that comes up with that is, and I have historically always advised my client to pursue the appropriate criminal action and lay charges and so on against that person. And my experience in that regard is that the cost to the business is extreme, in that the amount of time that it takes going through the court proceedings and so on, for what might be, it might be significant in nature, but not necessarily significant in value, and the cost to the business in time out and loss of focus and so on is quite horrific. How do we deal with that? Now, should we be advising our clients, look, we know that your staff member has stolen from you, has committed fraud, but it's actually, is it really worth pursuing it?
Yeah, it's a very good practical question, Wayne. I mean, there's certainly a great deal of time spent in the courts. If you do go that route, it can be very unrewarding. The outcome is not always ideal. I think it's also a very personal decision. Andy spoke about grace and second chances. Where do you draw that line at a personal level? But then again, you also have an obligation to future employers and others who may interact with that person in the future. For example, about a year ago, I was contacted by a client who suspected fraud on the part of their bookkeeper. It turned out that this person had been convicted of fraud just 5 months previously, given a suspended sentence, and within 5 months had gone back to their old ways of committing fraud against their employer. And it just struck me at the time, okay, there was a prosecution in that case, but the decisions you make in dealing with people have repercussions for the next employer down the line. In this case, the employee obviously didn't reveal everything in her CV, but the decisions we make have impact on others, and I think that also needs to be taken into account, but not an easy question, and I don't think a universal answer.
Yeah. Thank you, Tim. We've got a couple of comments there from our larger panel, if you like, from our participants, from Chris there. Mercy cannot rob justice. And Johan, rather help your client to rectify the fraudulent transaction to become clear. Yes, there is that opportunity, which certainly as advisors to our clients is an opportunity for us to help our clients remedy the situation on a practical level, rather than just looking for revenge. But yeah, that doesn't necessarily have to be tied to the prosecution or not prosecution of a fraud.
Just a quick comment. It just occurred to me that if we choose to go the mercy route and try and get the person to mend their ways, it's not just a case of getting them to stop doing what's wrong. There might need to be a restitution. There might need to be repentance is a righting of wrong. So you might need to. There might be a cost involved. We're not just talking about sweeping something under the carpet when we say we want someone to change. They might have to pay back money or whatever. It would be a bigger process than just warning them not to do it again.
Right, thanks very much, guys. Does anybody want to have a final comment? Because I'm just looking at the time, and can you believe that it's already an hour gone? It's amazing how time flies. And I'm just conscious of the fact that we still we've got a case study that we need to get to. So, Wayne, what I'd like to do, if you're okay with it, is see if I can actually drive this from my machine. And yeah, you maybe just tell me when you want me to go to the next slide. But Wayne, if you wouldn't mind just presenting the VW story to us, please. Thanks. Over to you.
Right, folks. What we thought is reasonably topical is just to go through what happened with VW and what they call their cheat device, and just to go through some of the background there. What happened is VW put in place some software that would allow them to manipulate the emissions of a particular vehicle. So Shane, if you could just go to the next slide there for me. Before we go into kind of the details of the device, I need to just give you guys a lesson in the way that the emissions work. And if you look on the left of your screen there, you've got your diesel engine with your pistons that go up and down, and basically that emits carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. And what vehicle manufacturers do is they either treat the emissions that come out to make them lower before they get exhausted, or they reduce the emissions in the engine itself. And the way that they treat those is they use generally something called urea, and they add that into the kind of the exhaust pipe, and they put the exhaust through a catalytic converter, and the end result is that your emissions are less toxic to the environment when they come out of the exhaust. What VW were doing is not on that side, but they were looking at reducing the actual emissions that were put out by the engine itself. So Shane, if we could move forward to the next slide there. Just to give you some of the background to this is that in 2005, VW went on a very aggressive sales and marketing drive within the US to increase their throughput, if you like, or their sales within the US market. And to increase sales, they needed to meet the very stringent emissions control that the US has, in particular in California. And what happens is that pressure, if you like, cascaded down the organization into your engineering department, where a group of engineers in a powertrain development division began to modify the way that the engine emits those emissions. So in other words, they changed the way that the engine works to reduce the emissions that came out. Unfortunately, in doing that, they reduced the performance of the engine. So in other words, it wasn't as powerful, it wasn't as fast, it wasn't as fuel efficient, but it did lower the emissions that came out of the engine. So under very, very tight kind of budget and performance constraints from your, if you like, your strategic direction of the company, this group of engineers modified software, the engine management system, and they changed about 15,000 algorithms within their software management system to be able to reduce these emissions. Now, what this was just a very, very clever piece of software at the end of the day, and unfortunately the software, the intent of the software was very, very, very specific, and it wasn't just to reduce the emissions and sacrifice performance, but it was to identify specific scenarios and then only make those adjustments in specific scenarios, and those scenarios were limited to when the car was in a test environment. And that's kind of, for me, where the crux of things going wrong for them were. I look at it and I say, well, when we were in the US a while ago, we drove a fancy big V8 engine, and when we were just cruising along the freeway, the car shut down half the engine and it became a V4 instead of a V8 to reduce fuel efficiency and emissions and everything else, and that was pretty cool. And then you put your foot down and you accelerate hard, and suddenly the engine management system very cleverly turns on the other 4 cylinders, and now you've got a big, powerful V8. And of course, you just watch the fuel consumption go down and start looking for the next petrol station. But what the VW engineers did was really quite similar to that, but they defined, or they limited the use of it from everyday use to a test environment. And because of that, it was really a manipulative thing that they did there. The end result is that in real-life testing, so for real-life tests, showed that the emissions compared to the test environment were something like 40 times higher than what happened in the test environment. And that had some fairly significant repercussions for VW. As you know, the CEO stepped down. Martin Winterkom, he resigned, and now. It affects a couple of engines. It's really their TDI engine, their turbo diesel engine, and over the period from when this technology or the software came into being, VW produced 11 million cars with this engine type in it. Now VW says that they only really need to modify or recall 800,000 cars. Now, but given their propensity to certainly given their history, and also the comment that Andy made earlier, if you lie once, kind of no one trusts you in future. So one of the things that VW did in their comments, you'll see here that this is kind of their advertising. We've broken the most important part of our vehicles, your trust. So they've acknowledged that by doing what they've done, they've destroyed their own integrity with the market. And what we want to look at today now is just a couple of questions that come out of this. Now we know that what they did was wrong. There's no debate about that. But there are issues around this that perhaps are not quite so clear. The first one is really the corporate risk, if you like, around this, and does that pose an ethical issue for us? So let's a little bit more detail here. The pressures placed on staff, including management, by directors and also shareholders, is significant, and it does drive the decision making in our business. It affects bonuses, it affects incentives, and it also possibly could affect the job security. You might not have a job if you don't do what you're being told to do, or meet your budgets and targets. And as an accountant, this is really evident in our international financial reporting standards. You might be aware that there's a new standard on leases that's come out. It only becomes effective next year or the year after, I think. But what they're doing is they're trying to combat the off-balance sheet financing that happens with operating leases. So instead of companies buying an asset and depreciating it over time and so on, and they're renting assets, and generally that's being driven because they are measured, the executives are measured on return on assets, and they will strive to keep that return high. And the way that you do that is keep your asset base low. So that's happening, and as a result of that, the standard setters have recognized that there's a whole bunch of asset acquisition that's happening out there, but it's happening under the table, under the financial statements, so to speak, and they're trying to bring that onto the financial statements to say, okay, we now need to account for these operating leases on the balance sheet. And that's just kind of evidence of how the pressure or the incentives that come down from directors and shareholders and so on will actually influence the decision making of a company as a whole, even when in those situations where it's less beneficial for the company as a whole. Now, in VW's case here, there was certainly pressure to sell cars in the US market. This couldn't happen unless emission levels were met, and this pressure led to software being designed to meet those emission standards. Can we or should we place responsibility for this ethical breach on the shareholders and the directors?
Wayne, Tim here. I think a lot comes down to the senior leadership of a firm. You know, they obviously experience competitive pressures and other pressures, and they then form a strategy and communicate this down to other managers and employees to respond. The problem comes in if those pressures are communicated without being moderated by an ethical system, and in particular if your firm doesn't have an ethical culture, so that over a period of years you've built up ethical standards and systems which then counteract possible extremes and excessive or wrong responses to competitive pressures. I have a client for whom I have a huge amount of respect. They're a financial services firm, and I had lunch with their managing partner the other day, and I was absolutely amazed when he told me that they don't give their consultants a budget. So their sales consultants, as it were, do not have a budget, and they certainly are not told to sell a particular product because there's a higher markup on it, for example, or a higher profit margin. They actually don't have a budget at all, and that flows from their philosophy that they want their consultants to give the best possible advice to Tim Brown when he walks in the door. They don't want them to be thinking about their budget or which particular product is most advantageous to their firm. Firstly, that gives me a huge amount of trust in them, and secondly, I'm told they've got business, you know, coming through the door. They just can't keep up with it. So I think an ethical standard from the top, you face competitive pressures with courage, you do not flinch, and allow the ethical issues to go out the door.
All right, well, thanks very much, guys. I don't have anything further to add to that. So what I thought I might do at this point, unless there are any objections from the crew here, I've got two questions to finish off with. The first one is, what is the difference between morals and ethics? I'm just battling to, just at this point, the difference between those two terms. And let's get your input on this one. If something is morally wrong, does that make it unethical? So maybe if you could just think about that, and let's just run a poll on that. If something is morally wrong, does it make it unethical, yes or no? I will just pause the record.
Efficient through the engine management system. Yes, they designed the system to be more emission friendly when power and performance weren't needed, and to sacrifice the emissions when power and performance were required. Is that not a good thing? Surely they've done something good here, not bad. Yes, I understand. You'll point out to me that you'll say, well, actually, it's not what they've done, but it's how they've used it. So, guys, what do you think? Do you think that the software engineer should be able to sleep at night? Yeah, let's. Shane is saying let's run a poll on that. What do you guys think? Do you think that the software engineers there who designed the system should be able to sleep at night? Yes or no?
Which is quite interesting. So, yeah. Thank you.
Wayne, yeah, it seems like there are two parts to your question. The first is, how do you understand what the engineers actually did and what was their intention? The second part I note there, Wayne, is an interesting one, following orders. does that have any relevance at all? And I suppose it's easy to say from one's armchair, but I don't think that following orders is an excuse. It's obviously given rise to war crimes all through our century in the past, and obviously cannot in itself be an excuse. I mean, for an employee, for example, I think you've got to be prepared to stand up and suffer some consequence for your ethical system. So it's not purely a theoretical thing. The moral side, are you willing to do what's right or wrong? If it has no or limited consequences, that's easy. But if it has quite negative consequences for you, are you still willing to do that? It still remains right or wrong. What are you going to do? So I thought that was an interesting point, Wayne. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Tim, I think for me on this one is what the engineers did, I don't think was wrong. I think that designing an engine management system that was so clever, I think was a good thing. I think the issue for me here is how it was used. It was a decision to use it to deceive people. If you had used that to cut the emissions while the car was idling at a robot, and not with the foot flat on the accelerator, then we'd all be praising those engineers. I don't think that what the software itself or the intent to design the software was necessarily wrong. It's the intent to use it. In the same way, you can go back to the scientists who developed the atomic bomb. They didn't intend to develop a bomb. They were following science and inventing stuff, and it's how people use that. I don't know. What do you think?
Andy here. I think the way Wayne posed the question was interesting. Should they sleep easy at night? In other words, their own conscience is what we're talking about. And I think at the end of the day, that is the question. We've got to conduct ourselves in a way in which we can sleep easy at night. We ought to know what our ethical standards are, unlike Rat in our cartoon who just changes them willy-nilly. But we have a certain ethical standard that we have depending on our culture, our upbringing, what our parents have given us, something like that, maybe what our profession dictates. And we need to conduct ourselves within that so that we can sleep easy at night, that we do nothing that's against our own conscience. And I would agree with Tim on that one. If you're a software engineer asked to do something that you know for sure is going to be used deceitfully, you might have to take the hit and resign or stand up or do something so that you can sleep easy at night when all is said and done. That should be my take on it.
Yeah, I think, Jolene, your comment there, if management directors give the order to do the wrong thing and you as the employee know it's wrong, but you're scared to lose your job, what are the ethical implications there? Should you go ahead and do it, or should you just keep quiet about it? Jolene, from my perspective as an accountant, if you like, the comment that I have there is that doing the right thing is not always going to be either easy or the most cost effective. It's going to hurt, and in some circumstances, being able to sleep at night might be being able to sleep at night without a job. Certainly from our fundamental pillars of integrity, objectivity, due care, confidentiality, and professional behavior. If I was in an environment like that, let's say I was the accountant within that engineering department, and I knew that was happening there, I would certainly, given that it was an open secret, in VW's case here, everybody within the engineering department knew what was happening. Could I say, and knew, the question is, did they know how it was being used? And if they did, then as an accountant, I couldn't just ignore it. I would have to make the hard choice.
Just as an aside, whistleblowing legislation is common across most jurisdictions today. So technically speaking, it would not be possible to fire someone simply because they raise these kind of ethical concerns. Of course, in reality, you're placed under all different types of other less formal pressure by employers, or can be in these situations. It's also interesting, I was at a talk last night on the influence of social media and how hard it is today to keep wrongdoing under the covers, including political wrongdoing. So in recent events in our country, these things just get out. And, I'm surprised that, for example, a VW employee didn't blow the whistle anonymously through social media, but it's just a warning to us all that what we think might be done in secret can get out there in the blink of an eye onto the whole country's cell phones. It's an interesting point.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. That's certainly something that is a question in my mind as well. Is how come we didn't hear about this sooner? How come it didn't get out? Just coming back, you've heard me mention the fundamental principles established by the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants, and that's the ethics, if you like, arm of IFAC. And we've got those 5 fundamental principles, but the overriding principle across all of those things is that as accountants, we want to act in the public's interest, in the best interest of the public, and that's kind of the overriding thing here. So if you look at what you're doing, and you say, well, is it? And Tim, I know that there's a legal side of that as well. Is it in the public interest in terms of judging whether something is kind of right or wrong?
Yeah.
Okay. We have Shane. I think let's go back one slide. We've just looking at the last aspects of the third question. Is kind of what about the other employees that are in the department? Perhaps we've covered that. So I think maybe we leave it there. We have covered that with what we're talking about. Okay, you've got a comment there from Chris. I think VW's top management rationalized it and filtered down through the ranks. Quite possibly software development showed what would happen. Management had to implement it or not. Val. Yeah, Val, I like your comment there. As I say, I'm sympathetic to the software engineers.
Sorry, I'm just doing some work in the background there. There's some interesting comments that are coming through. I think there's 1 or 2 more that I might want to put up on a slide. Wayne, if I can just ask you to read Michael's comment, actually read it out and just share it with just discuss it as well while I get these other 2 on ready for discussion.
Well, thank you, Michael. Okay, coming from a European background, I know that most companies do have internal channels to report any misconduct, as Tim, where you were referring to a little bit earlier. The engineers knew that their technology would be used in an unethical way and thus had the obligation to report it accordingly. The question there, I guess, Michael, we don't know the answer to it here is, did they? Did they report it and it was ignored, or did they just not report it? Obviously, if they were involved in developing it, they're not going to report it. Then they are, they're part of the problem. You're not going to have thieves going and saying, I'm a thief. But certainly, I can't believe that every engineer in that department could either have such low moral or ethical standards and also not be knowing what was going on. And then a comment from Lee there, ethics won't feed Jolene's kids at the end of the month. Yeah, Lee, you're absolutely right. And having a good ethical standard, it doesn't mean that you are going to have food on the table at the end of the month. Unfortunately, it's the harsh reality there.
It's a very good practical observation from Lee. But in reading about this, I think I read that VW anticipates or has spent $7.3 billion on putting this problem right. So, at an individual level, those kind of issues come up. Senior management, senior leadership at VW must be asking themselves, was it all worth it? It certainly wasn't. It seemed worth it at the time. It seemed like a good idea, but in the long run, the consequences were severe.
Yeah, I think, perhaps bringing it up a level, taking it away from VW for a moment there, and looking at one of the key passions, if you like, for me is entrepreneurial spirit. And I quite often encourage people to look at new ideas and new ventures, if you like. I have what they call a cigarette box evaluation. You say, well, is it a good idea? Let's just do the maths on the back of the cigarette box. What do I think my sales are going to be? What do I think my costs are going to be? Is it economically viable? Can I make a profit? And I kind of when I have to turn that on its head when I look at it from an ethical viewpoint, because you start saying, well, you might not be able to make a profit on something like that, but it might still be in the public's best interest. It might benefit so many people to have this thing happen, whatever it might be, either the service or this particular product, but it's not going to make you money. Should you still do it? And that's a different situation as well. Now, it's fine to answer that question when you're a billionaire and you can afford to throw money away, but if you're not in that position and you still need to feed your family, and Jolene's kids at the end of the month, how does that change or impact on your decision making?
Right, I think that I've just been getting some messages. Some folks have to run and they're just saying thanks for the session and already wanting to score it. So thank you for that. Folks, maybe just to talk about that last question, if we could maybe just finish on that. I'll just put it up again. We've run a poll on it already. So let me just remind you what it was. It was, what is the difference between morals and ethics? If something is morally wrong, does that make it unethical? We did run the poll, and the results that came in, I'll just share them with you. We had 76% saying yes. So that's basically 3/4. 24% no. And maybe if we could just finish a quick round the table comment on that, and I'll get the closing slide ready. Andy, we're going to put you up first if that's okay. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it comes down to understanding the difference between morals and ethics. Something that is morally wrong, unethical. I guess the question is, who's asking? Is it unethical in your eyes, or is it unethical in your company's eyes? Does it violate their ethical policy? But of course, if you're an individual working for a company, you're obligated to work under their ethical standards, presuming they're legal and right and not lower than your own. Otherwise, leave that company and find another one. But yes, if something is immoral, it has to be against. It has to be unethical. It has to be going against the ethical standards that that company or individual has set. Otherwise, it wouldn't be counted immoral. It would be moral under that particular set of ethical standards.
All right, thanks very much, folks. I think just in closing then, unless there are any other final comments, what I'd like to do at this point is just thank the team, obviously, and leave you guys with a question that we're not gonna run a poll with at this point. We're gonna leave it for next week, so something to mull over between now and next Friday. Let's just say you're going home after work this afternoon or this evening, and a traffic officer pulls you over for speeding, and you're obviously very embarrassed. You were speeding, there's no doubt about it. He opens up his ticket book and he says straight away, you pick up there's something different in his approach, and basically the gist of it is, we have a problem, what can we do about it? Now the question, if you guys can just think about that, we would like to know, what should you do or say in response to that kind of situation? And so, yeah, thanks guys. This is from our side. Thank you for joining us this morning. We look forward to working with you next week, same time, same place. I'm going to put up contact details and just run a final poll while we do a quick round the table just to say cheers. And can you just let us have we normally do this for those of you who haven't attended one of our webinars before, just ask for a quick feedback. Was it a tops, very helpful, or okay? Okay, the last two options, if you feel that it can be improved, we'd love to know what we can do to improve it. And if there were any sound issues, we've split that up as well. So there's two options there. But won't you please just score that before you run? And when you are done, if you can click on the red cross in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And thanks for tuning in. And we look forward to working with you next week. Same time, same place. From me, Shane Webb, cheerio.
Thank you very much, folks. Some here.
Well, guys, please give some thought to your ethical issues next week. We love the questions. We love the adrenaline rush that comes from them. So we look forward to your challenging questions next week. From me, goodbye.
And this is Andy signing off. Looking forward to chatting again next week. Thanks.